This is a battlefield. One side has twice the men, 3 times the equipment, every advantage on paper, and they lose. So how does the smaller force actually win? In this video, we're going to break that down. Why numbers matter less than you assume, the 4 principles that let smaller forces beat larger ones, the historical battles that proved every one of them, how modern armies still use every single one of these principles today, and the mistakes that turn a winnable fight into a disaster. More men is an advantage. Nobody serious is arguing otherwise, but it's a conditional advantage. It only pays off if you can actually use all those men at the same time, in the same place, against the same target. And that is much harder than it sounds. A massive army needs more food, more water, more supply lines, more time to move, more coordination to function. It is slower, it is harder to hide, it is harder to change direction quickly when something goes wrong. Size is a strength, but size is also a liability. And the smaller force that understands this has already found the edge it needs. The first principle is terrain. Where you fight matters more than how many people you bring to a fight. A narrow mountain pass, a river crossing, a dense forest, a street in a city. All of these are force equalizers. They physically prevent the larger army from using its numbers. At Thermopylae, a few thousand Greeks held back a Persian army hundreds of thousands strong for 3 days. Not because the Greeks were better soldiers in open ground, but because the pass was so narrow that the Persians could only engage a handful of men at a time. The 10,000 behind them were useless. They couldn't reach the fight. Numbers become irrelevant the moment the terrain makes them impossible to deploy. This is not a lucky accident. Commanders who win when outnumbered pick their ground deliberately before the battle starts. The terrain is your friend and weapon. The second principle is concentration. Never spread your smaller force evenly across the whole battlefield. Concentrate everything at one point. Hit it harder than the enemy expects. Break through before they can reinforce. The Battle of Cannae is the most studied example of this in military history. Hannibal faced a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own. He didn't try to match them across the whole line. He deliberately weakened his center, let the Romans push through, and used his stronger flanks to wrap around and encircle the entire Roman force. The larger army was destroyed almost completely, not because Hannibal had more men, because he forced the fight to happen on his terms and at the point of his choosing. The third principle is speed. A smaller force can move faster than a larger one. Feed it less, resupply it less, change direction faster when the situation changes. Speed is force multiplication. The German advance through the Ardennes in 1940 succeeded not because Germany had more men or better equipment than France. It succeeded because the attack came faster and from a direction the French didn't expect. Speed makes the enemy's plans obsolete before they can execute them. The fourth principle is surprise. Not just tactical surprise, catching the enemy napping. Strategic surprise, making the enemy fight somewhere they didn't plan for, at a time they didn't expect, in a way they didn't prepare against. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, an exhausted, disease-weakened English army faced a French force several times its size. The French had every advantage except one. They chose to advance across a narrow, muddy field that neutralized their cavalry and compressed their men into a killing ground perfectly suited to English longbows. The English didn't win because they were better soldiers in a fair fight. They won because the conditions turned a desperate last stand into a slaughter of the army that was supposed to end them. Surprise doesn't require secrecy. Sometimes it just requires understanding the battlefield better than the enemy does. Here's what most people miss. These 4 principles don't work alone. They stack. The commander who picks the right terrain, concentrates force at the right point, moves faster than the enemy can react, and structures the fight so the enemy walks into conditions they didn't prepare for. That commander takes every one of the larger force's advantages and turns them into liabilities. Rorke's Drift in 1879. 150 British soldiers held a fortified position against 4,000 Zulu warriors for 12 hours. They used terrain, fortification, concentrated fire, and rate of fire to neutralize a numerical disadvantage that should have ended the fight in minutes. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded. The principle is always the same. Control the conditions. Make the enemy fight the battle you chose, not the one they planned. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Modern warfare didn't change any of these principles, it just made them faster and harder to see. Terrain now includes the electromagnetic spectrum. Jamming the enemy's communications before they can coordinate their larger force is the same principle as holding a mountain pass. It makes their numbers useless. Concentration of force is now done with precision strikes. Instead of massing infantry at one point, you mass firepower. A single drone strike on the right command node can break a larger force's coordination instantly. Speed has become the defining advantage of special forces. Small, fast, lethal units that move before the enemy can fix their position and respond. And that brings us to the mistakes, because history is full of smaller forces that had every principle available to them and still lost. Mistake 1. Trying to fight on the enemy's terms. The moment a smaller force abandons its chosen terrain and engages in open ground against a larger army, it hands back every advantage it had. Fighting fair when you're outnumbered isn't brave, it's a decision to lose. Mistake 2. Spreading too thin. A smaller force that tries to hold every position ends up too weak at every position to hold any of them. Concentration is not optional. It is the whole strategy. Mistake 3. Winning the first fight and forgetting the second. A smaller force that wins the initial engagement sometimes makes the mistake of staying in place, consolidating, celebrating. The larger force regroups. Reinforcements arrive, the window closes, speed doesn't stop being a principle after the first contact. Mistake 4. Underestimating morale. A larger force that is confused, surprised, and taking heavy casualties from a position it can't effectively attack will break faster than its numbers suggest it should. A smaller force that understands this fights to create psychological collapse, not just physical attrition. The goal is never to kill every enemy soldier. The goal is to make the larger force decide that continuing costs more than stopping. Mistake 5. Waiting. A smaller force that sits and waits for the larger force to come to it on the larger force's timeline is giving up the one advantage it always has. Initiative. The side that decides when and where the fight happens controls the outcome more than almost any other factor. Waiting is surrender disguised as defense. Every outnumbered force that ever won did the same thing. It refused to fight the battle the larger force came prepared for. It picked the ground, set the conditions, moved faster, hit harder at one point, and made the enemy size into a problem instead of an advantage. The numbers on paper never told the whole story. They never do. Every army that ever lost when it had more men made the same mistake. It assumed the numbers were enough. They weren't. They never are.